There are 8 conferences with teams remaining in the NCAA tournament. The ACC, as we mentioned, really almost off the top, 4. The Big East with 3. The SEC, Big 10, Big 12 with 2. The Pac-12 with Arizona. The Mountain West with San Diego State, and the West Coast Conference with Gonzaga. Kevin Flaherty, 247 Sports, college basketball writer, joins us on 365 Sports. Kevin, thanks for your time. NC State's the only remaining double-digit seed. Are you surprised there wasn't one other or two that made it into the Sweet 16?
Yeah, I am a little surprised. I think a lot of times when we talk about, this season is really wild and anybody can win it. One of two things happens. It winds up going extremely chalk, which is what it did. But a lot of other times it goes a lot like people think, and you see a number of upsets. You see all these teams pushing through it, and I thought it was really interesting. One of the things that surprised me a little bit, I know you can say this on just about any year, but some of the teams that entered the tournament with a lot of momentum kind of laid eggs a little bit. When you look at New Mexico, when you look at some of these teams that people were, McNeese really didn't play well, teams that people were thinking, okay, they've generated a lot of momentum. And then you had NC State that, needed the ACC tournament just to get in. And you had Clemson that, was not so great down the stretch either. And they're both still playing. And so I think it goes to show that as much as we always talk about, hey, you want to be playing your best basketball in March, it's important to enter on the tournament on a high note. A lot of times it really matchups and how a team plays on a specific day is just much more important than whether or not a team is playing well overall.
Yeah, one of those teams, Kevin, that got bounced in the first game was Auburn, a team that played very well, and they had a style that seems to, especially when you're looking at a team that can unseat UConn. To me, it was Auburn because they shoot threes, they play crazy defense, they're crazy athletic, all these things, but that did not matter when it came down to it on Friday.
Oh, you're preaching to the choir. I loved Auburn. I thought Auburn had a really great chance to go to the Final Four, and I thought when Selection Sunday happened, I thought, oh my gosh, that is a brutal matchup for UConn to get in their Sweet 16. And it was interesting because I think on most days, I think Auburn goes ahead and kind of handles Yale. It was, I don't want to say fluky because that takes away from what Yale did, and it was impressive. But, you have the flagrant 2 where the guy gets ejected. You have Auburn, not playing really its best game. And that's the thing about it. You can go home in those situations. I know, we obviously talk just about every time about Baylor. And, I think Baylor beats Clemson, a vast majority of the time. But I think that when you look at that game, at the shots that Baylor missed, they were good shots. They were open 3-pointers and, looking at the free throw numbers and all of those different things, they just didn't fall on that given day. And that's the great part about the tournament when your team wins. And the bad part about the tournament when your team loses is you can look at it and say, hey, it just wasn't our day, and that cost you a chance at a national championship.
Having said that, Kevin, do you think Jeff Capel feels somewhat vindicated in his comments, given where the ACC sits with a quarter of the field, or do you think it's not exactly that same conversation? It's just that they happen to have maybe the best teams at the top and the best draws. And then again, they might not have anybody in the Elite Eight by the time it's all said and done. I mean, the way that it works out. But do you think that the ACC feels, I guess, a little bit vindicated based on the lack of draws they got?
Oh, I'm sure Jeff Capel feels absolutely vindicated. And I'm sure the league does as well. But at the same time, I'm one of those people that, because of the randomness of the NCAA tournament, we're not talking about, a best of 7 series here. We're talking about one game at a time, single elimination, because of the randomness that goes with that. No team makes shots from the outside for a full 6 games. You remember that Villanova team that, just made an absolute mockery of the 3-point line on its way to the national title? that team shot, what was it, like 3 for 21 or something like that against Texas Tech in the Elite Eight from three. But they were able to find a way to win. And I think that's why people always talk about having multiple ways to win games in March, is because at some point the shots don't drop. And you do need to have sort of that extra gear. And so I guess that's a really long way to say that, I'm not a big proponent of taking how a conference does in wildly different seeded games and everything else and saying, well, this conference is better than we thought. This conference is worse than we thought. I did think the ACC was really strong at the top. And I wrote even before the season started that I thought the ACC had some teams like Clemson, and Wake Forest was another one that didn't get there, but had that kind of potential that, hey, in a single elimination tournament, they might be able to win a couple games because they were going to be really tough to match up with.
So am I right to think that at some point during the season, even though they were usually in the top 10, that Duke had a stretch where you kind of not forgot about them, but it was like, huh. And we know that Gonzaga had theirs. Remember, there were thoughts they may miss the tournament. What have they done to put themselves in a position? Duke was a 4 seed. Gonzaga's obviously a higher seed too, a high seed. But what have they done to turn themselves around to where they're both now on the I guess precipice of being in the Elite Eight?
Well, with Gonzaga, I mean, it helps when you make everything. I think that you look at how well they shot it, and some of it can be attributed to the fact that Kansas just did not match up well with Gonzaga defensively at all. But having said that, you could even see the Kansas players throwing their hands up in the air sometimes, and that whenever a guy got an open shot, it went in. At one point, I think they were shooting over 80% in that second half. And, when that happened and Kansas hit, sort of its customary little dry spell that it's hit all season, Gonzaga ran away and hit. And when you're hitting shots like that, you can beat just about anybody. And I think Gonzaga's offense can compete with just about anybody. I do question the defense, and I wonder how that's going to look this week against Purdue. With Duke, the thing about Duke is Duke may be the nation's most talented team. When you look at, hey, these are guys that the NBA is looking at, their entire starting lineup are former 5-star players. And I don't think anybody else across the country can say that. And so it was one of those things where, hey, if you catch Duke on the wrong night and one of their guys has an NBA type game, it's just kind of curtains for you. And Jared McCain has had some of those moments this year, and he wound up having one of those in the second round. I know NBA teams are really excited about his shot making potential and the different things that he can bring. And so, when it comes down to it, if you've got more talent than the other guy and your talent's playing up to its potential, you're going to be really tough to beat.
One of the things about Duke as well is I was looking at their schedule as you were talking, Kevin. They have 4 of their losses are the 3 teams that are still playing. Arizona early, sure. North Carolina twice, and then North Carolina State in the ACC tournament. So it's not like they have a couple like the Georgia Tech game. Arkansas, who we know was very much underachieving this year. Pitt, who is a team that, felt like they should have been a part of it. So it's not like they have just like, oh, my God, because their 4 of their losses are the teams that are still playing along with Duke. Paul?
Yeah, Kevin, I do. Here I have secret information from the Gonzaga locker room. This is what Mark Few said. Just make shots. Just make them. Don't let them go out of the basket. Let them go in. And that worked. For Kansas, after the game, you heard Bill Self talk about, building the roster and that they made some errors along the way, and the way that they were dealing with everything, that they were going to look at it a lot differently. He'd been thinking about it for a month. Given his health scare last year and then the misses they had on this roster, how different do you think that this offseason will be that, one, he's not coming off a heart attack, and two, he has the perspective of they stepped in about every landmine that a Kansas team could step in?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think coming off what he was coming off, and then, the thing that nobody wants to talk about that's, the elephant in the room is Arterio Morris. Mm-hmm. Kansas would have been a lot better team this year had Arterio Morris play, but you knew that you were opening Pandora's box when you signed Arterio Morris. This wasn't something where you didn't have information on it. And so Kansas was down 2 scholarships from the NCAA sanctions. So they were down 2 right off the bat. They essentially lost the third with Arterio Morris. Nick Timberlake, the shooter that they brought in from Towson, didn't shoot at the level that he did at Towson. And Marco Jackson, who they brought in, who was a McDonald's All-American, wound up being a lot more raw than they thought he was. And just like that, you wind up in that situation where, Kansas is playing Gonzaga with 8 healthy scholarship players, with Kevin McCullough being out. And I think that when you look at Bill Self, one of the things that has made him a really great coach is his ability and willingness to adapt. And you look at the fact that, a lot of his better teams have actually been very different than each other, and the way that they've been built, the way that they've executed, and in a lot of ways, the things that they've kind of hung their hat on. And I think that the next part of that adjustment for him is going to be really attacking to make sure that they aren't shorthanded again. And so with Kansas's NIL war chest, which, my understanding is pretty considerable, I would expect Kansas to potentially add another elite recruit. Liam McNeely's out there, picked Indiana over Kansas and then wound up reopening. I think that's a very real possibility. And then, I expect Kansas to go full bore out on the transfer portal. And so instead of being a situation where, you wind up with these guys that you wind up with basically 5 guys that you trust to play, I think Bill Self is going to fill up the full 12 scholarships that he's got. And it's basically going to be guys biting the hands off of each other to play next year.
Do you think that guys like the guys that are eligible, I mean, DeJuan Harris is going to be back, he's already said, but Dickinson might be back, and then they have to wait and see on Furphy in the draft?
Yeah, I think Hunter Dickinson's going to be back. A lot of his comments that he's given over the course of the year is sort of, I'm really enjoying myself. There's a really good chance I'll be back unless, he kind of made it sound like it, depending on how the year ended. And I always took that, the way that he put it was, hey, if Kansas wins a national title, if Kansas goes to a Final Four, you feel like, you don't have anything left really to prove at this level, then that could mean an exit. But I would expect Hunter Dickinson back, especially with, the Kansas efforts in NIL there. I expect them to quite frankly make him a better offer than the NBA will. And I think Johnny Furphy, with the way his second half of the year, last quarter of the year, I guess you would say, with the way that went, I would expect him to come back too. I think that him coming to Kansas was supposed to be a multi-year deal. I think initially, the way that he kind of took off, I don't want to say surprised people, but his stock certainly rose there for a little bit, but ultimately, barring a lottery guarantee or something like that I don't think he's going to get, I would expect Johnny Furphy back at Kansas too, which raises some questions because you just, you didn't mention KJ Adams. He can be back next year too. And then are you really running it back with 4 starters from this year's team? I mean, and trying to run it back in a similar way. I think that's a fair question to ask if that's something Self even wants to try to do.
Kevin, quite the night in Memphis for Kelvin Sampson and the Cougars. I mean, not making the Sweet 16 would have been an awful big disappointment, but there they find themselves after Buzz Williams and the Aggies give a valiant effort to send that game to overtime. How much fun did you have watching that one?
Oh, that was unreal. I mean, it's, for not having a quote-unquote dog in the fight, I think everybody was biting their fingernails for Houston, with the Aggies being down, I think it was 12 right at the 2-minute mark. I think it was 11 with 90 seconds left. And to give that up, and how often do you see in tournament games or even in regular season games, when a team gives up that kind of lead and goes into overtime where, they're just going through the motions at that point. They've already been beaten. And, Houston, you add the extra layer on top of that of having 3 starters having fouled out, with Emmanuel Sharp fouling out right at the start of overtime, I don't see any way that Houston should have won that game in overtime, except for a guy named Jamal Shedd, who was just terrific. He accounted for, I think, 10 points in overtime, had 5 points, 2 assists, one of which was for a three-pointer. And so when you look at how Shedd played, and of course you have the Hoosiers kind of Ollie moment with the walk-on coming in for a free throw after Shedd, fouls out and he makes one of two to kind of help seal the game. I mean, it was an incredibly mentally tough victory, and one that, quite frankly, I'm not sure there are 5 teams in America that win that game after the way that regulation ended, but the Houston Cougars are one of them.
All right, West Virginia, Darian DeVries, new basketball coach, was very successful at Drake. What are your thoughts about what they were able to do to move into at least a new era?
Yeah, I like the hire in general. I also like the hire when you're bringing your NBA son with you. Like, I expect that he probably will be, in Tucker DeVries. I think West Virginia is a good job. It's kind of funny looking around at different message boards and everything else. DeVries was a guy that a lot of Oklahoma State fans, it felt like, kind of had circled and was on their short list. And a lot of them were kind of unsure about, why are we losing this guy to West Virginia? And I just want to remind people, West Virginia had maybe the best transfer class in the entire country before the Bob Huggins destruction last year. And, guys wound up leaving at that point, and West Virginia had the season it did. But I say that only to mention that apparently West Virginia's NIL coffers are alive and well, and they're willing to put in investment there. Obviously, we've seen West Virginia have success through the Big 12, several second-place finishes. I don't think they've won a Big 12 title just yet. But, it's a job where you can find success. I think DeVries is a really good hire. I think it doesn't help when doesn't hurt, when you're bringing Tucker DeVries in with you. Again, like I assume that he probably would. And I think there's a very real chance for him to surround Tucker with some pretty nice talent in Morgantown.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Great stuff as always. Always great to have you on, especially after another weekend. Sweet 16 in the NCAA Tournament starts on Thursday. Kevin Flaherty, college basketball national columnist and also college basketball insider. Real quick note break, then Pat Nunley.